Now that I've put quite a few miles onto the Blazer and have had a lot of time to try tuning it, it's become clear that the carburetor on there is not going to get me the kind of fuel economy I'd like. Currently, with mostly highway driving, the fuel economy averages out to around 11 miles per gallon. That's bad. For a big truck or a muscle car, that could be acceptable, but this isn't one of those. It's not only a very mild engine, but it's a light truck, and it has a 4-speed in it, albeit the torque converter lockup still isn't wired to anything, and that would help some. It would not make the kind of difference I'm looking for. I do, however, still plan on doing that in the future. But I firmly believe the main problem is this clapped out carburetor. The throttle shafts are pretty loose, which makes it difficult to get a stable idle below maybe 800 or 900 RPM. It also seems that no matter what I do with the choke, it can be difficult to start sometimes. When it's cold, it'll always start almost immediately, but then it'll start to bog down as if it's too rich or too lean. I've never really figured out which. It's been a little tricky, and I assume the vacuum leak past the throttle shafts has something to do with that. And then, when you try to start it with the engine hot, it takes a couple seconds of cranking before it really kicks over. I don't know if it's not getting enough gas, but I don't think that's the problem, because if you pump the pedal 2 or 3 times, it takes the same amount of time to start, and then you've just made the parking lot smell like a gas station. I've leaned the carburetor out to the point where it stumbles under acceleration and is probably lean at most engine speeds, and none of the jet or rod changes I made had a significant impact on fuel economy. Interestingly, it's not far off from the same miles per gallon I was able to get out of the Firebird with the 750 CFM Edelbrock on it. The best I ever got out of that thing was 12 miles per gallon. So, in pursuit of fuel economy, I decided to go with a different kind of carburetor, a Rochester Quadrajet. It seems like any time the topic of fuel economy comes up, the Quadrajet is always the 4-barrel carburetor of choice. So that is what I set out to find. Despite Quadrajets being absolutely everywhere and available for very cheap prices, it actually turned out to be a bit difficult to find the one that I wanted that didn't look like it was dredged out of the bottom of a lake. Eventually, this posting came up on the local Craigslist, and the price is a bit high, but it seemed to be in good shape, so I went out to meet the guy. I had a few concerns about it, but it was indeed the model I was looking for, and I had spent enough time searching for it that I just went ahead and bought it from him. So let's take a closer look at this thing and talk about why it was difficult to find the one I wanted. The thing these carburetors are perhaps most known for is their spread bore design. The primary and secondary throttle blades are significantly different in size. This has several benefits, but perhaps the biggest one is the fuel economy. Since at idle and low throttle it's completely on the tiny primaries, in this operating range they're able to get even better fuel economy than a 2-barrel carburetor, since even a small 2-barrel has to have openings larger than these. And once you get into heavier throttle application, those massive secondaries start to open and can provide enough air and fuel for pretty much any engine. Most Quadrajets have a CFM rating of 750, but there are some higher CFM units out there. This is a 750 CFM unit off of a 1980 truck. So what makes this particular one so special? What makes this the Quadrajet I wanted? The first thing is something I've already mentioned. It's actually in really good shape. The previous owner said this came off of a running car, and I believe him. And this has already been rebuilt in the past, meaning that some tasks have already been taken care of. First up, the plugs have already been removed that covered up the idle mixture screws, so those are already accessible. And the bottoms of these tubes have already been epoxied, which is pretty much necessary to keep things from leaking. But that's not the only thing I was looking for. Here we come to the main reason I wanted this particular carburetor. And that reason is this throttle arm. This particular shape of throttle arm is made for throttle valve cables. That means it shouldn't require any modification to use the TV cable required by the 700R4, and that is very good news. As we've discussed in the past, the throttle valve is extremely important to the operation of a 700R4 and is looking for a pretty specific pull. So it's possible to make some kind of a bracket to make an older Quadrajet throttle arm work on a throttle valve cable, but with this arm, everything is already set up correctly, so it's not necessary. From what I can tell, this type of throttle arm was being put on these carburetors at the tail end of the 70s so that they would work with the 204R transmission, which also uses a throttle valve cable. And I think these arms were used right until the end of the Quadrajet's life. So if the throttle arm was used for so many years, why is this one so special? Well, it's because it's an older model. This is a 1980 version, which means it has no computer controls. In 1981, GM released the computer-controlled Quadrajet. That has a solenoid which controls the fuel mixture and a couple of other things inside of the carburetor. I don't want one of those because I don't want to have to deal with a computer. The other good thing about the later Quadrajets is they made quite a few design improvements and changes throughout their life. So this is pretty much as good as they get. So finding this carburetor from a span of just a couple years in good shape, even at a bit of a high price, was too good of a deal to pass up. There is one thing I don't like about this package, and I have a way to correct it, but it involves spending more money. Something that's pretty particular to the way Quadrajets work is missing. I've already removed the choke, but I haven't removed any of the linkages. So what you'll see is we have one vacuum actuator which sits up front. This one looks brand new. I didn't buy this, it came with the carburetor. So we have the primary vacuum canister, but no secondary. There should be a secondary vacuum actuator which mounts to these bolt holes that hooks to both the choke and the secondary air valves. I had to do some research on this to try to figure out the specifics because I had a general understanding of how these work. Basically what this one does is as soon as the engine starts, the choke is still holding the flap closed because the engine is cold. So as soon as this receives vacuum from this fitting, in a time of around 2 seconds, and it's adjustable via this screw, this will retract and pull the choke open a little bit more. This prevents the excessive use of fuel which could foul spark plugs or just make it run a little bad until the choke opens a bit more. The secondary diaphragm on this particular one would have 2 linkages and would be able to pull off the choke a bit if it was still activated and the throttle blades were open far enough to lower vacuum to a certain point. But the main use of the secondary pull down is the air valves. The actual flow of air is what opens these valves. A common misconception is that a Quadrajet is a vacuum secondary. Quadrajets are manual secondary. As you can see, even with no vacuum and no vacuum canisters, the secondary throttle blades are opening. What Quadrajets have that makes them special is this air valve up top that is opened by airflow. There's only enough airflow when the load upon the engine demands it. That's what makes Quadrajets so universal and able to be used on tiny small blocks or huge big blocks and still provide the right amount of air and fuel. Then what's the secondary diaphragm for if it's not opening the valves? Basically, it acts as a sort of shock absorber, so when the vacuum decreases, these are allowed to open. With nothing on there, at a snap wide open throttle, what happens is these things flip open real fast and that can create a bog until the fuel starts flowing and the mixture corrects itself. Lots of people run without the secondary actuator and not all Quadrajets have 2. I found quite a few people that said they prefer to remove the secondary actuation because they like the snap of it opening or just because the engine seems to like it when things are set up that way. So obviously it isn't necessary. Different versions of the Quadrajet have different setups and not all of them even have 2 pull downs. The best price I could find for the actuator and the 2 specific link rods I need is around $35 shipped. I'm going to go ahead and try this carburetor without those parts and see how it does. If it seems like it's acting a little funny as the secondaries are opening, then I can go out and buy them and install it while everything is still on the vehicle. So that's why I chose this particular carburetor, and even though I paid a little more than I wanted to for it, I think it is going to work very well for our application. But we're not just going to throw it on there. It did come off of a running car, but it was on that thing for at least a couple years, and then it sat for a couple more. So we're going to do a very basic rebuild before we put this thing on the Blazer. To help out with some of this process, I made this little stand. Made is not necessarily the right term. This is just a spreadboard to square bore adapter. This one came on the Firebird actually, that I put some bolts through and put some nuts together up top to hold everything in place. You could do the same thing with a block of wood, but this was quick and easy to throw together and will make some steps a bit easier. This isn't a perfect stand. I would like to make a nice carburetor stand at some point, but this helped to show off the carburetor and I think it'll help out during the rebuild. To remove and later to adjust the idle speed screws, I made a little tool by cutting down one of these screwdriver hex bits and simply cutting a notch in it to fit the head of the idle mix screws. You can turn these with needle nose pliers, but it's pretty awkward and I would not want to do that on the vehicle. Of course, you can buy tools like this, or even get replacement idle mixture screws that you can turn with a flathead screwdriver, but this tool works in a pinch. We'll start the rebuild by just taking everything apart. The choke pull-off and the choke are already removed, but everything else connecting the top cover to the middle of the throttle body has to be removed. remove the secondary rods, and then all the air horn screws can be removed, including the 2 underneath the choke flap. You punch out the pin to remove the accelerator pump arm, then the top cover comes off, and everything inside of it can be removed. Same as any other carburetor, you want to keep track of where everything is and where the adjustments are set on any adjustment screws. For the APT screw, you can count the number of turns it takes to bottom it out. For the idle speed screws, you count the number of turns past contact with the throttle levers. We'll carefully remove the float and the needle and the seat and the jets, and write down the part numbers for the jets and the primary and secondary rods. For any fine tuning down the line, this will be useful information to have. The check ball for the accelerator pump was really stuck on this thing. What ended up working was soaking it in PB Blast for a little while, and then using a rubber mallet to knock it loose. This carburetor was in pretty good shape, but from the looks of it, it was left sitting with gas in it for a long time, so the gas evaporated, which left everything all gunked up. And now we have the carburetor about as far apart as we're going to take it. The primary throttle shaft has had bushings installed, which is why there's so little play on it. There are no bushings on the secondary throttle shaft, but those usually wear much more slowly. A common Quadrajet issue is to have the core plugs at the base leak fuel, which causes the bowls to go empty and can even flood the engine. The later models, such as this one, have that problem much less frequently, but it does still happen, as you can see by where the previous builder has already applied epoxy. I'm going to be removing this epoxy because it's old and I just don't trust it. I was basically able to just chip it off with the screwdriver. After disassembly, I realized that this carburetor is actually an 800 CFM and not a 750. The easiest way to tell is by looking for this little bump in the side of the Venturis. An 800 CFM will have a very pronounced bump like this. The maximum diameter of the primary barrels is 1.37 inches, and the minimum diameter around 1.19. A 750 CFM would fit this engine a bit better, but since these Quadrajets are so adaptable, it should not be a problem to have the larger carburetor. Now we'll go ahead and clean things up a little bit. I basically soaked everything in degreaser, and then used brake cleaner to clean up all the small parts or heavy deposits. I'm also using Scotch-Brite and some wire brushes to clean things up. I sanded the edges of the throttle blades smooth because the secondaries kept hanging up a bit in their bores. They were hanging up closed, so I basically deburred the edge and smoothed out the edge of the throttle bores just a little bit with some sandpaper until everything consistently opened smoothly. Once all the parts were cleaned and ready for reassembly, I started putting it back together with new parts from a rebuild kit. I'm trying not to mess with any internal calibrations or anything like that. I just want this thing to run, hopefully like it did when it was new. There are quite a few small parts, and you want to make sure everything goes back in as it came out. I put some JB weld over the core plugs. I did have to do some trimming to get everything reinstalled though. You want to make sure you're not introducing any leaks to that base gasket. And after knocking out the APT plug, I tapped it for a 3/8 inch plug and made one out of a bolt. That way the carburetor is still sealed, but it's easy to make changes to the APT if it's necessary. There are some tricky parts like feeding the primary rod assembly through the top gasket, but if you take your time and have a bit of patience, everything will go back together. Another tricky part is getting the choke arm connected through the housing. What worked for me was getting the whole carburetor at an angle so that everything would line up correctly until everything was screwed in. With that installed, on goes the choke pull-off, and the accelerator pump link. After some testing to make sure everything still mechanically works as it should, the rebuild is pretty much done. I also installed an electric choke, since the hot air choke that came on this thing isn't going to hook directly up to the Edelbrock manifold. But that's no trouble. I made sure to get one with a pigtail so that I can easily hook it up with the current electric choke wire. The last thing I did was set up the opening of the throttle blades. These were adjusted pretty funny, as you could see before I took the whole thing apart. The secondaries were opening very quickly and actually hit full open before the primaries did. That's pretty far off of what you're actually looking for. I had to bend this link rod a whole lot to get it back to where it should be, where the secondaries start to open as the primaries hit around 70 degrees. And then they both hit a full open of 90 degrees at the same time. Now that that's all set up, the last thing to do should be to install it on the truck. So we'll unhook and unbolt the old carburetor. We'll disconnect the cables, the vacuum hoses, and the fuel hose. Then we can remove the hold down nuts and take off the carburetor. Okay, so here's the Edelbrock we're removing and the Quadrajet we're installing. So let's go ahead and get this dropped onto the vehicle. The threads for the inside bolt holes aren't actually cut all the way to the bottom, so I'm going through and using a bottoming tap to cut the threads a little bit deeper to make sure the bolts I'm using don't bottom out, and to make sure there's no oxidation or just crud in those threads since the Edelbrock was mounted on the outside holes. So with the intake manifold prepped, we can drop on the lower gasket and heat riser, sprayed with a little bit of WD-40, and then the carburetor itself. It took a few washers on each bolt to get the thread engagement correct, but that isn't a problem. What is a problem is the cable bracket. So the throttle arm on the Edelbrock is about an inch closer to the back. On the Quadrajet, it's an inch farther forward because of how big the secondaries are. So once again, we need to modify this throttle bracket. After adjusting the bracket as far forward as possible, the alignment and distance still just wasn't correct. So what we're going to have to do is once again hack up this bracket. The first step was to separate the TV and throttle cable brackets from their bases. Once that was done, I measured up the bracket on the vehicle and tack welded everything together. So after a lot of trial and error and trying to get everything to fit just right, I ended up with this. I had to angle things a bit differently since this carburetor is a bit narrower, and then I had to move around the position of the throttle and TV cable bracket until everything looked just right and the angles and length were correct. I also mounted this tab to hold the throttle return spring. It sure ain't pretty. This thing is really a mess. I think this is the 4th time I've remade it, but it's still nice and sturdy and should be about perfect for this custom application. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and tighten down the carburetor mounting bolts. The closest I could find to a torque spec for Quadrajets is 144 inch-pounds on all 4 corners, and then, after a heat cycle, retighten everything to 96 inch-pounds. This allows the base gasket to relax, and then you make sure everything is still tight. So first we'll carefully tighten everything to 144 inch-pounds. Okay, now everything is bolted down. So now we'll get the cables installed. And I'm just going to use a little bit of white lithium grease where the cables ride on the throttle arm. And we'll get an initial setting for the TV cable by retracting it all the way and then opening the throttle manually until it clicks and sets itself. In my experience, you want that a little tighter than it'll normally set, so I'm going to push that in just one more click, and we'll see how that does. A shorter cable means harder shifts, which is generally easier on the transmission. But once we start driving, we'll look closely at the speedometer to see exactly where it's shifting to make sure it's doing things correctly. Another thing we can do is measure it and compare it to the before. So 3.64. We're going to go ahead and try that for now. It's very close to what it was before. And we're going to use the existing upper mount on the throttle arm. I couldn't find a whole lot of information about this, but I believe this upper one is usually used for trucks and the lower one is used for cars. The lower one will have a slightly shorter pull and a slightly longer cable. I made sure that where I mounted this bracket, the pedal has plenty of travel, so it seems like it'll work just fine on the upper mount here. It starts at a good height and it can easily get to wide open throttle. And we're just using a little C-clip to hold the throttle cable on. And then we can hook on our throttle return springs. With dual springs, if one breaks or something goes wrong with one of them, you always have the other one you can rely on. Dual throttle springs are more important for a Quadrajet than with an Edelbrock or a Holly, because those have return springs on the primary throttle shaft. That means there's not a ton of tension there, but they will try and close on their own. A Quadrajet does not have that. The only reason it's closing right now is because of the TV cable. So having 2 springs here is really the equivalent of just having 1 spring on a Holly or Edelbrock carburetor. Okay, it looks like this is in pretty good shape. So that all feels good. I think we're in good shape over here. I made this little fitting out of the one that was on here with just a flared piece of aluminum tubing and the flare nut that came in the carburetor. I also installed a paper filter, not really because I think I need its filtration, but just because that's how these were originally set up, and I couldn't find a whole lot of information about whether or not these would have problems without a filter installed. I don't think they would, but the later model versions like this one are supposed to have a one-way check valve on the filter that prevents the fuel from draining back out when it's shut off and prevents excess leakage if the vehicle is flipped over. I also tightened down the filter nut to 18 foot-pounds. I have the PCV hooked up to this main fitting here. The 3/8 inch fitting at the back is plugged because the brake booster hose is actually installed on the fitting on the intake manifold. This green cap is just capping off the choke. Since there's no hot air hookup on this manifold, then we're using an electric choke. Since the choke is still internally hooked to vacuum, there will be vacuum in there, and this cap prevents creating an excessive leak. This short hose is for the front choke pull-off, and I found some conflicting information, so I'll have to test this for myself, but I think this is ported vacuum for the distributor advance, so I have that hooked up here, and this appears to be manifold vacuum for the evap canister, so that's hooked up there. Before hooking up the fuel hose to the carburetor for good, I'm going to use a fuel pressure gauge to turn the regulator down to 4.5 psi. Everything I read told me that a Quadrajet on a relatively low performance engine like this would prefer having closer to 4 psi of fuel pressure. I believe the lowest this regulator was rated to go was 4.5, which is why I don't really want to drop below that. Okay, this gauge is hooked up in line with the carburetor, so we'll go ahead and turn on the fuel pump and see what pressure we have and make sure the carburetor doesn't start flooding or anything. Okay, it looks good, and like we're right on the dot at 5 psi. I'm just going to look down the neck and make sure the accelerator pumps are working. Okay, that seems to work just fine. With this regulator, we just loosen the lock nut. I'm actually removing the lock nut all the way because I intend on Loctiting it back on there. And then we just turn this with an Allen wrench to set the fuel pressure. Now I'll go ahead and, while the fuel pump is still on, tighten the lock nut to make sure it doesn't change. So let's turn the fuel pump on and off a couple of times to make sure it seems consistent. Okay, seems pretty consistent. I'm sure it would have been okay, but under certain situations like really bumpy roads or off-roading, all of the fuel sloshing in the carburetor makes it easier for the needle to unseat, and you really want to run as little pressure as possible. We'll cut off the old connector for the choke and splice on the new pigtail. And then with the choke connected, we'll give everything a once-over, and then see if she starts. And the engine started right up. The carburetor needed a fair bit of adjustment from where it was set. With the throttle all the way closed and everything else adjusted as well as I could get it, it was still idling around 900 RPM. I checked all around for vacuum leaks, even going so far as to remove the carburetor, double-checked that all the gaskets were sealed, and adding gaskets on the top and bottom of the heat riser for good measure. Spraying carb cleaner around the engine, I could not find any leaks. Quadrajet carburetors have an idle air bypass system. This system does exactly what it sounds like and brings air past the throttle blades through a separate circuit at idle. What I think is going on here is that somebody had modified the idle air bypass circuit to feed an engine with the larger camshaft. Doing some research online, it seems like this is a relatively common modification. Basically, it involves drilling out the passage to make it wider and allow more air past the throttle blades. Unfortunately, I think the only way to fix this will be to disassemble the carburetor again, block off those passages by filling them with JB weld, and re-drilling them with a smaller size. But at this point, I just need the car working again. So I'll set the idle as best I can with this speed and go from there. Other than the idle speed, this carburetor did run pretty well. I did have to adjust the APT screw just a little bit, but after doing that, it runs pretty well. It starts much better than I could get the Edelbrock to, and it's a really steady idle, even if it is on the high side. So unsurprisingly, this carburetor is going to need some more work. But the good news is, even with a bad tune and the idle speed being much higher than I'd like, it still manages to get around 14 miles per gallon. So after all that work, for now, that's the change I'm left with. Unfortunately, it's still not where I want it to be, but it is a step in the right direction. This bird is gonna make me... I'm losing my mind. I'm absolutely losing my mind, bird. It doesn't quit. God. Even if I cut that stud, that's still gonna be a little too tall. Why is this so hard?